A prominent couple, respected throughout their community, was stabbed to death inside their own home. Nothing about the case made sense, not the crime scene, not the motive, not even the forensic evidence. Stabbing is a deeply personal crime. There is often some kind of relationship between the victim and the killer, but as a task force of agents and police quickly learned, nothing about this case was ordinary. Etna, New Hampshire, was a small town, the kind of place where people trusted their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. Then a double murder shattered that trust and left the entire community terrified. I'm Randall Keene, former head of the FBI's New York office. The FBI and local police worked day and night, trying to uncover a motive for a crime so brutal that even experienced investigators struggled to understand it. Claire Whitman stopped by the home of her friends, Vivian and Arthur Mercer. She was supposed to have dinner with the couple. It was not like them to forget a dinner engagement. She called out as she entered the home expecting an answer. Instead, in the study, she made a horrifying discovery. The room was in ruins. Her friends were on the floor. Blood was everywhere. Hanover police arrived quickly after receiving the dispatch. Detective Nolan Pierce of the Hanover Police Department was among those who responded. By the time he arrived, some information had already been relayed. There were at least 2 bodies inside the house. Claire told police that both victims were prominent professors at nearby Dartmouth College. Arthur Mercer was an earth sciences professor. His wife, Vivian, chaired the German studies program. Claire was their colleague, and they had invited her over for dinner. The Mercer home was extremely neat, clean, and orderly. Nothing in the house appeared out of place, except for the study. The home had 2 levels and no basement. Because the house had not been secured, Detective Pierce and a patrol sergeant moved through it systematically, making sure the killer or killers were not still inside. Pierce had seen violence before, including during his military experience, but nothing compared to the horror of that study. At first, investigators considered the possibility of murder-suicide. But if it was not that, and it was a double homicide, the scene suggested the couple may have been preparing a light meal before they were killed. Although the bodies were discovered around dinner, Pierce suspected the Mercers had died earlier, before lunch, and had been dead for several hours. There were so many valuables in the home that investigators could not immediately tell whether anything had been taken. But near the fireplace, they found small drops of blood and what appeared to be a bloody footprint on the floor. Pierce's first concern was preserving the evidence. The nearest available items were pieces of kindling by the fireplace. He used them to cordon off each blood drop and footprint, hoping they could later be analyzed. The Hanover Police Department was a small-town agency with limited resources. To solve a crime this terrifying and puzzling, they would need all the help they could get. Because of the size of the department, the Major Crimes Unit of the New Hampshire State Police came in to investigate. Sergeant Graham Harlow became the lead investigator. His unit had more experience handling homicide cases of this magnitude than most local departments. Investigators focused first on the study, the primary crime scene. A crime scene, if studied carefully, can speak. The position of the bodies, the physical evidence, and the condition of the room can reveal what happened, how it happened, and sometimes even who may have committed the crime. Vivian Mercer's body was lying near the door of the study. Arthur's body was farther inside the room. An overturned chair was near his feet, and 2 other chairs had been placed near the desk. It looked as if a conversation had taken place before the attack. Near those chairs, police made a startling discovery. They found 2 black tactical-style knife sheaths. They were identical and long enough to hold large combat-style blades. Police believe the missing knives had been used to kill the Mercers. If there were 2 sheaths, there may have been 2 knives, and 2 knives could mean 2 killers. In the living room, investigators followed a blood trail leading from the study to the front door. Everett Vale, director of the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Laboratory, was relieved to see that the blood evidence had been carefully protected. Preserving the scene prevented officers and medical personnel from stepping on and destroying the footwear impressions. Sergeant Harlow noted that the front door was unlocked. There was no sign of forced entry. That raised more questions. Had the Mercers invited the killer or killers inside? Did they know whoever did this? Near the fireplace, Vale examined the bloody boot print. He wanted to enhance the impression for comparison, so he used a blood enhancement reagent. Once applied, the impression became clearer, making it potentially useful for identification. If investigators ever found a suspect, that boot print could become powerful evidence. Carson Bell, an assistant attorney general assigned to homicide cases, responded because suspicious deaths required immediate notification to prosecutors. In this case, the victims were beloved and respected professors from an Ivy League college, which made the case especially unusual. The violence inflicted on the Mercers was far beyond what was necessary to carry out a crime, even a killing. It had the marks of a crime of passion, something personal and emotionally charged. The unlocked door, the extreme violence, and the apparent overkill all suggested the Mercers might have known their killers. If that was true, police were looking for someone who hated them enough to stab them brutally inside their own home. Whoever committed this crime was cold-blooded and dangerous. Investigators needed to find that person before they could kill again. To do that, they needed a motive. At first, investigators believed the killers might try to leave town quickly. They checked the local airport, the bus station, and a cab company. One cab dispatcher reported that a driver had picked up a local college student late at night and taken him to an airport. Investigators quickly learned the student had flown home because of a family emergency. With no other leads, police assumed the killers had either left town by car or were still somewhere in the area. Soon, the double homicide became headline news. The Mercers were prominent citizens and their deaths shocked everyone. The medical examiner determined that the wounds on their bodies were consistent with a tactical combat knife. Both victims had been stabbed numerous times in different areas of their bodies, and their throats had been cut. To Sergeant Harlow, the nature of the attack mattered. A stabbing is intensely personal. It is not like firing a gun from a distance. A killer must get close enough to feel the victim's struggle, close enough to inflict each wound by hand. Once again, the evidence suggested the Mercers may have known their killers. The knife sheaths became one of the best clues. Forensic specialists developed fingerprints on the back of one sheath. Those prints were searched through a fingerprint identification system containing records from known offenders. There was no match. That left investigators with several possibilities. The person who left the print might not have been in the database. The print quality might not have been strong enough for a match. Or the person could have been arrested before, but their prints were not properly entered into the system. Police then turned to the bloody boot print. They collected footwear from everyone who had entered the crime scene, including neighbors, emergency medical workers, the medical examiner, investigators, and even personnel from the Attorney General's office. The lab eliminated all of those shoes and boots. Vale suspected the boot print belonged to one of the killers. He scanned a photograph of the impression and sent it to the FBI laboratory's footwear section, asking them to compare it against a database of thousands of outsole patterns. The FBI determined that the impression had been made by an upscale brand of hiking boots. It was a useful clue, but without a suspect, it meant very little. Investigators now needed information, and that meant talking to people. In this case, that was a massive challenge. Everyone seemed to know Arthur and Vivian Mercer. They had extensive faculty connections and hundreds of students who had taken classes with them. Investigators went to the college where the Mercers worked, trying to learn everything they could about the victims. The investigation widened in every direction. Police interviewed people on campus, off campus, relatives, neighbors, colleagues, and students. During campus interviews, investigators identified a person of interest, one of Arthur Mercer's students. Another student reported that Arthur had argued with him shortly before the murders. Police questioned the student and learned that he had an extensive knife collection. During the interview, they also noticed a recent abrasion on his head. For a moment, investigators hoped they might be onto something. The student voluntarily answered questions. He explained that he had been friendly with Arthur since taking his earth science class. He said the incident had only been a joke. Police checked his background and confirmed that he had a solid alibi. He could not have killed the Mercers. Investigators also examined the Mercers' relationships with colleagues. They learned that Arthur had recently received a position another professor had wanted. Investigators traveled across the country to interview that professor because he had been in the Hanover area around the time of the murders and then left. His car was impounded. What appeared to be blood stains were found in the trunk. But testing revealed the stains were not blood. The owner said they came from stew that had spilled in the trunk. While investigators chased every lead, two detectives focused on finding the murder weapons. They visited retail stores that specialized in knives. The sheaths found at the scene were made for one specific type of blade, a paramilitary or tactical knife. It was the kind of tool used by military personnel and some police agencies, not something an average hiker would normally carry. The manufacturer provided authorities with a list of authorized retailers and distributors across the country. There were also hundreds of dealers selling the knives online. Investigators realized they would need to track thousands of blades and sheaths distributed across the country and beyond. They did not have enough manpower to do that alone. They called in the FBI. Special Agent Warren Adler, assigned to the FBI's Bedford, New Hampshire resident agency, joined the case. Authorities knew the investigation would reach beyond New Hampshire, possibly into other states and even internationally because of the Mercers' backgrounds and connections. The FBI, state police, and local police formed the Hanover Task Force. The case dominated the news, and officials repeatedly asked anyone with information to come forward. The volume of tips became enormous. To manage the flood of leads, the FBI deployed its Rapid Start computer system, a database designed to track hundreds or thousands of tips in major investigations. In any investigation, agents must keep their peripheral vision open. If they focus too quickly on one theory, they may miss signs that point in another direction. As investigators struggled to make sense of the case, media coverage exploded across the country. The pressure on law enforcement grew intense. Two brutal killers were still free. Investigators reviewed the evidence again and again. The crime was messy and confusing. They tried to determine whether the Mercers had been targeted. It did not look that way. The knife seemed too clumsy a weapon for a planned assassination. The killers had made amateur mistakes, leaving behind sheaths, a footprint, and even a fingerprint. Ironically, despite the extreme violence and the evidence at the scene, investigators began questioning whether the Mercers had any connection to their killers at all. As the case developed, it seemed less and less likely that an acquaintance had committed the crime. Investigators also initially ruled out robbery because nothing appeared to have been taken from the home. The murder did not fit the normal patterns experienced homicide investigators had seen before. There seemed to be no obvious motive except the killing itself. It was as if the victims had been killed and the culprits had run straight out the door. Agents contacted the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group in Quantico, Virginia. They wanted to understand the minds of the killers. They turned to profilers. FBI criminal investigative analyst Marshall Graves found the case unusual. Two low-risk victims had been killed inside their own home during the day in a neighborhood where people were likely to be nearby. The position of the chairs made it look as though an impromptu meeting had been happening before the murders. Investigators and profilers agreed that Arthur may have spoken with one or both offenders for several minutes before the attack. At that point, they leaned toward the theory of two offenders. They believed the killers may have been mission-oriented, meaning they entered the house with the purpose of killing Arthur and Vivian Mercer. The use of combat knives troubled Graves. The weapon used in a homicide can reveal a great deal about the offender. A cheap gun suggests one kind of criminal. An expensive pistol with a silencer suggests another. A knife, especially in such a violent crime, reveals something very different. The fact that the killers used knives and left behind crucial evidence suggested they were either sloppy, unsophisticated, or both. Investigators still suspected that the Mercers either knew the killers or had allowed them into the house for some unknown reason. Graves began to form an image of the offenders, but the extreme violence disturbed him. When a case makes no clear sense from a profiling perspective, profilers often consider youthfulness. The motivation might not be money, revenge, or a grudge. It might be young people with poor judgment and no emotional filter, deciding to hurt or kill someone simply for the thrill. He feared they might be dealing with teenagers who killed for excitement. The FBI profilers released a list of possible post-crime behaviors to the public. Investigators asked people to think about anyone who had acted strangely after the murders, changed their appearance, missed work, or had unexplained injuries or bruises on their hands or arms. Calls poured into the task force. None of the tips led anywhere. After weeks of nonstop work, investigators reached a dead end. Nothing about the Mercer murders made sense. It seemed like a crime without a motive. With each passing day, the community grew more desperate. Two killers were still out there, and law enforcement had no idea why they had chosen the Mercers or who might be next. Then investigators learned something important. Arthur Mercer always carried a wallet, and that wallet had never been found. Before that discovery, the murders had seemed almost motiveless. But the missing wallet changed the way investigators saw the case. It could have been a simple robbery that went terribly, terribly wrong. If robbery was the motive, investigators had only a handful of clues: unidentified fingerprints, an unidentified boot print, and two empty knife sheaths. The task force focused again on tracing the knife sheaths and locating the murder weapons. At a certain point in an investigation, profilers provide as much behavioral insight as they can. Then the old-fashioned detective work must take over. Working with the manufacturer, investigators began tracking the sale of thousands of combat knives across the country. They also searched online dealers. Eventually, they contacted an internet retailer in Massachusetts. That retailer had sold two of the knives to someone in Vermont, within a short distance of the crime scene. That was a major break. The two identical combat knives had been purchased by a young man named Adrian Parker, who lived across the state line in Chelsea, Vermont. When investigators made contact at the home, they were surprised to learn that the purchaser was a juvenile. Adrian Parker was only 16. Detectives asked him about the knives. Adrian admitted he had bought two of them, one for himself and one for his friend, Trevor Hale. He claimed they purchased the knives for rock climbing. Detectives asked where the knives were now. Adrian said the knives were large, and the boys decided they were too heavy for climbing. According to him, they sold them at an Army-Navy store. One trooper later said the hair on the back of his neck stood up during the interview. The story did not feel legitimate. Investigators asked Adrian if he would come to the police station to answer a few questions. He agreed. Then investigators interviewed Trevor Hale. He gave the same story. He said the knives were too heavy, so they sold them to a stranger at an Army-Navy store in Burlington, Vermont. Investigators were immediately suspicious. Trevor's statement was not merely similar to Adrian's, it was virtually identical. It sounded as if the boys had memorized their stories in advance. Then a detective noticed something chilling. Trevor was wearing the same make and model of hiking boot that matched the bloody print found at the crime scene. Very quickly, the detective realized he was likely dealing with one of the killers. Trevor agreed to go with detectives to the sheriff's office to be fingerprinted. Despite their suspicions, investigators had no arrest warrant and no solid evidence yet to detain either teenager. Both boys had no prior criminal history, had cooperated with police, and had voluntarily provided information, fingerprints, and footwear. Late that night, investigators called Everett Vale at the forensic lab and asked him to compare Trevor's boots to the bloody impression from the crime scene. To obtain an arrest warrant, investigators needed proof that Trevor's boots matched the boot print found inside the Mercer home. The pressure was enormous. The case had created an intense level of public and professional scrutiny. Forensic examiners knew that one mistake could destroy a career. They checked and rechecked their work carefully. After hours of comparison, Vale and a colleague matched the impressions from the crime scene to Trevor's boots. The fingerprints collected from the scene also matched Adrian Parker. Investigators now knew they had identified the killers, and the two killers knew it too. After state troopers left, the boys fled. After weeks of searching, police and agents had finally identified their suspects, only to lose them. Two deadly teenage killers were now on the run. Armed with warrants, police went to the boys' homes in Chelsea, Vermont. Both teenagers lived with their parents. By the time investigators arrived, they learned the boys had fled during the night, each telling his parents he would be with the other family. Detective Pierce questioned Trevor's parents. They had no idea where their son had gone. It was difficult for investigators to deal with the parents of the killers while knowing what they knew. They saw that the families were good people, but their children had become murderers. Inside Trevor's bedroom, investigators made a crucial discovery. In a cardboard box, they found 2 combat knives. Adrian and Trevor had claimed they sold the knives to a stranger. Instead, investigators had found what they believed were the murder weapons. Once the knives were discovered, it became clear what they were dealing with. The opinions of investigators hardened. These 2 teenagers had been directly involved in the murders. The case now shifted from identifying the perpetrators to pursuing fugitives. The momentum and intensity increased. There was satisfaction in finally knowing who had committed the crime, but now police had to catch them. A lookout alert was issued for 2 teenage boys driving a silver Audi. They were wanted for questioning in connection with the Mercer murders. Law enforcement had to assume the worst. No one could know what was inside the minds of 2 people who had already killed. Profilers often say that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. The boys were considered armed and dangerous, and every relevant agency was warned to use extreme caution. Their pictures appeared in newspapers and on television across the country. The FBI issued a federal unlawful flight warrant to assist in the fugitive investigation. That allowed the Bureau to bring significant resources into the search. In Massachusetts, a state trooper found an abandoned silver Audi at a truck stop. He ran the license plate and learned within minutes that the car belonged to Adrian Parker. Agents converged on the truck stop. An employee remembered seeing 2 clean-cut teenage boys asking truckers for a ride to California. One had dark hair worn in spikes, the other was blonde. They used false names. Investigators were able to narrow the trail from the moment the boys abandoned the car. They learned that in Sturbridge, the boys had hitched a ride with a husband and wife trucking team, who later dropped them at another rest stop. The FBI moved quickly, notifying trucking companies and dispatchers that the 2 teenage boys were wanted and believed to be armed and dangerous. Authorities learned that the boys may have been spotted at a truck stop in Columbia, New Jersey. They had apparently hitched another ride with a trucker. As the information improved, investigators began to understand where the fugitives were heading. Police across the region were notified that the boys seemed to be traveling west. In Indiana, a sheriff monitoring CB radio chatter heard a trucker ask if someone could give 2 boys from New Jersey a ride to California. The sheriff did not reveal he was a police officer. He told the trucker he would be happy to give the boys a ride and instructed him to drop them at a nearby truck stop. The officer raced to intercept them. Based on the alert, the suspects were armed and dangerous. He called for backup along the way. He may have found the killers. At the truck stop, the officer approached the boys and asked for their names. They gave false identities and claimed to be from California. Their answers quickly began to fall apart. The officer confirmed the descriptions and took Adrian Parker and Trevor Hale into custody. Both were returned to New Hampshire. A hearing was held to determine whether Adrian, though a juvenile, would stand trial as an adult. He was eventually certified as an adult for the murders of Arthur and Vivian Mercer. After that ruling, Adrian's attorneys approached the state. They wanted him to testify against Trevor. Adrian cooperated with law enforcement and was interviewed extensively by New Hampshire State Police and the Attorney General's office. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of accomplice to second-degree murder. In exchange, he agreed to testify against his best friend. He told police the chilling story of what happened the day the Mercers were killed. The 2 boys had grown bored with their lives in Vermont. They imagined going to Australia or some faraway place. They decided they would rob someone, take an ATM card or credit card information, steal around $10,000 and use the money to fly away. Their first plan was to knock on someone's door and say their car had broken down, asking to come inside and use the phone. They tried this in Vermont, but the person immediately sensed they were dangerous and slammed the door in their faces, ordering them off the property. That person came very close to becoming a victim. When the broken car story failed, the boys changed their approach. They began pretending to be students conducting a school survey. They arrived at the Mercer home completely at random. Tragically, because Arthur and Vivian were college professors, they were open and trusting towards students. They invited the boys inside. In the office where Arthur was murdered, it was clear he had been sitting at his desk, speaking with the 2 teenagers as they pretended to take notes and conduct an interview. Then a signal was given and they murdered him in cold blood inside his own study. Arthur and Vivian Mercer were teachers. They believed in helping students. Tragically, that dedication helped lead to their deaths. Investigators believed the boys may have killed simply for the thrill of it. Their goal was to commit a violent act and the Mercers happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, inside their own home. After the murders, one of the boys admitted they realized they had left the knife sheaths behind. They even considered returning to the house to retrieve them. But when they passed by, police were already there. Investigators continued searching for some way to explain why Adrian and Trevor had murdered the Mercers so brutally. FBI profiler Marshall Graves saw this type of random violence as part of a terrifying trend. Young people were increasingly exposed to violence, and in some cases the motive was not revenge, money, or a grudge. It was simply the impulse to hurt or kill. During interviews, Adrian showed no signs of emotion and no real remorse as he described how he and Trevor planned and carried out the crime. The boys came from middle-class homes in a low-crime area. They had not faced many of the hardships associated with more troubled environments. Still, there was something deeply dysfunctional in them. When their personalities combined, a violent outcome seemed almost inevitable. Investigators would never fully know what it was about the two boys and their chemistry that triggered such rage. Adrian Parker was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Trevor Hale was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole.